Near the end of February in 2025, Germany hosted what has perhaps become their most historically significant federal election since the reunification of the country in the early 1990s. The previously governing center-left party, the SPD, suffered its worst electoral defeat in Germany's history since the time of Otto von Bismarck back in 1887, while a clear political divide emerged across the country seen in electoral maps like this one. The eastern regions of Germany were colored in the bright blue of a relatively new political party called the Alternative for Germany, better known by its German language initials, the AfD, a party that was only founded a little over a decade ago in 2013 that is now most often associated with the far right that has also been linked to neo-Nazis. The AfD's blue in the east contrasted sharply with the black of the Christian Democratic Union's victory across the west, one of Germany's other more traditional parties that is more center-right on the political spectrum. And almost immediately, it cannot help but be noticed that the border within Germany between where the AfD dominated in the east and where the CDU dominated in the west followed almost precisely the exact border of the former Iron Curtain that divided the country during the Cold War era, back when West Germany and East Germany were separate countries ruled by competing ideologies for decades between 1949 and 1990. The massive political differences that appeared between the former West and East Germanys in February's election, however, did not just end there. The AfD didn't just win in all of the former states of East Germany, it completely dominated them. Nationwide, the AfD won nearly 21% of the total German vote in the election, its best all-time record and the highest share of the vote that any far-right party in Germany has ever achieved since the era of the Third Reich. But in all of the states of the former East Germany, the AfD massively outperformed its nationwide averages. They secured more than 38% of the vote in Thuringia, more than 37% in both Saxony and Saxony-Anhalt, 35% in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and 32.5% in Brandenburg, while they only averaged about 18% of the vote in the states of the former West Germany. And interestingly, the AfD wasn't the only non-traditional populist party that performed exceptionally well in the former East Germany either. The BSW, a generally far-left party that also maintains certain similar positions as the AfD on friendliness towards Russia and opposition towards migration, performed much better in the East than in the West as well. And taken together, the AfD and the BSW achieved nearly half of all the votes in Thuringia, Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. Then there's also the other far-left German party, Die Linke, the modern successor party to East Germany's former ruling Communist Party, which, just like the AfD and the BSW, performed significantly better in the former East Germany than it did in the West. All things considered, the majority of Germans across the former East Germany voted for either far-right or far-left political parties during this most recent election, and rejected Germany's more traditional center parties, which stood in stark contrast to the Germans in the former West Germany, whose majorities continued choosing to vote for the country's more centrist parties and rejected the extremes. These clear political differences that you can see on a map between the former East and West Germany and today's Germany, however, are far from the only time that ghostly border between them continues showing up again. For example, here's a map showing the ratio of younger people in Germany today aged between 25 and 35, where you can clearly see the former border of the Iron Curtain between the East and the West. Here's a map showing the current unemployment rate in Germany that still shows the same East-West difference. Or how about this map showing disposable income per capita in Germany? Or this map showing population growth rates in Germany between 1987 and 2019? Maybe this map that shows the proportion of Germans without a migrant background. And related to that, this map showing the distribution of Turkish migrants to Germany, and this map showing incidents of anti-refugee violence events between 2014 and 2015. Then there's maps like this one that show where German women earn more than German men. This map showing where childcare is more commonly practiced. This map showing the amount of trash produced per citizen in Germany. This map showing the differences in religion in modern-day Germany. This map showing where all of Germany's most major corporate headquarters are located today. And this map showing the level of life satisfaction in modern-day Germany. Even if you look at Berlin tonight from far above, you'll still to this day see a clear divide through the city that precisely follows the path of the Berlin Wall that separated the city for decades between 1961 and 1989, with the former East and West Berlin still using noticeably different light colors. In truth, no matter the data that you're trying to show on a map of Germany today, you'll pretty much always see the same pattern emerging between the former East and West Germany following the historical Iron Curtain. And that then begs the question, why, after 35 years now following the collapse of the Iron Curtain and the reunification of Germany in 1990, are East and West Germany still so different and divided today in 2025? And what lessons might that hold for other divided societies that might want to reunify in the world today, like North and South Korea? In order to understand this, it's necessary first to understand how Germany was initially divided between East and West at the conclusion of the Second World War, and how that began leading to modern Germany's internal division we still see today. By 1945, at the end of the war, millions of tons of bombs had been dropped by the Allies across German cities. But the damage done wasn't geographically equal. The cities in what would soon become West Germany, on average, were significantly more damaged than the cities in what would become East Germany, owing to the fact that they were closer in range to British and American bombers for longer. With the notable exceptions of some East German cities like Dresden, Magdeburg, and Berlin that were significantly destroyed by the war, most of the other cities in what would become East Germany were spared from the level of destruction that was experienced in cities further to the west. Thus, after Germany was divided between a Soviet occupation zone in the east and by a Western Allied occupation zone in the west, the Soviet side was actually the one that started with a greater theoretical advantage of being relatively more intact. And it's perhaps because of that advantage that actually doomed the East. You see, because the East of Germany was more intact after the war than the West was, it also meant that there were more spoils to loot and pillage. And the Soviets that came to occupy the East were much more in the mood for revenge on the Germans than the Western Allies were. Stalin immediately imposed enormous war reparations on the Soviet occupation zone in the East, and pursued a much stricter policy of denazification than what would happen in the West. The Soviets confiscated all of the military and state-owned industries in the East and appropriated all of the territory's property that had been owned by members of the Nazi Party. As a result, the majority of East Germany's heavy industry was directly pillaged by the Soviets as reparations after the war, and was largely hauled back to the Soviet Union itself, which also represented a loss of 20% of East Germany's total production. Another 40% of East Germany's industrial property was quickly nationalized by the Soviets as well, which left only the remaining 40% of East Germany's industrial production behind in the hands of private enterprises. In total, between 1946 and 1953, during Stalin's later rule in the Soviet Union, East Germany was made to pay the equivalent of $14 billion in reparations in 1938 constant prices, which is equivalent to an astonishing $313 billion worth of reparations paid to the Soviets in 2025 inflation-adjusted dollars. West Germany, meanwhile, was made to pay significantly fewer reparations by the Western Allies, and was in fact given more than $19 billion 2025 inflation-adjusted dollars worth of direct aid through the United States' Marshall Plan immediately after the war, to help pay for reconstruction and to kickstart the economy back in a gear, aid that the East never received. Moreover, West Germany had several geographic advantages going for it over the East as well. West Germany had direct geographic access to Western nations like the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, and thus, the ability to trade directly with the Western world and by extension, with the rest of the world too. While East Germany had access to some navigable internal waterways like the Elbe and the Oder and Vistula rivers, they paled in comparison of scale to the navigable waterways that were found in West Germany, like the Rhine, the Main, and the Danube, which all handle orders of magnitude more cargo than the Eastern rivers do due to a variety of reasons that are beyond the scope of this video. East Germany, meanwhile, was effectively blocked from trade with most of the West, lacked anywhere near as capable waterways for trade, and relied heavily on trade with the rest of the Eastern Bloc instead. By the late 1980s, 2/3 of East Germany's trade was still being conducted entirely with the communist world. Western Germany also just had more natural resources than Eastern Germany did too, especially in hard coal. East Germany is rich in lower quality lignite or soft coal, but West Germany was richer in higher quality hard coal that's much better for heating and energy generation than soft coal is. After the war, West Germany relied on its own massive hard coal reserves to power their factories and to expand their valuable steel, chemical, and manufacturing services, which were vital to rebuilding the country's economy. West Germany, through their hard coal reserves, simply possessed a domestic and cost-effective energy source for large-scale industrial production that wasn't present in the East. West Germany's post-war surviving domestic industrial production also wasn't gutted like it was in the East by the Soviets, where the West Germans also received billions of dollars in aid to restart their production that wasn't provided by the Soviets to the East. Even though West Germany began transitioning away from their coal by the 1960s and the 1970s in favor of natural gas and oil, domestic West German coal was the primary power source that got West Germany quickly back on their feet through the 1950s and helped to kickstart the West German economic miracle. In 1949, Germany was formally partitioned between two different states as the Soviet and Western occupation zones coalesced into their own nominally independent countries. The Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, was established out of the Allied occupation zone in the West as a capitalist market economy that was aligned with the West, while the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, was established out of the Soviet occupation zone as a communist one-party state with a centrally planned economy that was aligned with the Soviet bloc. While the city of Berlin itself, despite being surrounded within the Soviet zone, was further divided between a capitalist West Berlin that was ruled directly by the Western Allies, and an East Berlin that was a part of East Germany. For the next 41 years of history until 1990, this would be the way that Germany would be politically divided. East Germany's more inefficient, centrally planned command economy further exacerbated its other inherent economic disadvantages relative to the West. For decades, the allocation of capital, natural resources, and labor in the East were all determined by the country's political bureaucracy, rather than by the logic of the market. While its harsh system of political repression and its lack of opportunities encouraged mass migration to the West as well. While East Germany never became a hardcore totalitarian state like North Korea did, it was nonetheless still a deeply paranoid authoritarian police state that attempted to crush any and all opposition towards communist rule. East Germany maintained an official policy of state atheism throughout most of its existence. Secularism was heavily promoted by the state, the influence of the church was curbed, religious education was restricted, overtly religious citizens stood to lose out on employment and education opportunities, while young people were pressured into joining the secular Free German Youth Organization for their social activities rather than the church. This is all what culminated in the significantly higher degree of irreligious people in East Germany than in the West that can still be seen today, where a significant majority of people in every East German state continue identifying as non-religious, compared to only smaller minorities of people who do so in the West. East Germany's communist secret police force, best known as the Stasi, also maintained a fascinating and nearly all-encompassing surveillance state over the country's population before modern 21st century technologies. The Stasi operated a vast network of informants all throughout East Germany, to the point where at its peak, it was estimated that roughly 1 in every 6 people in the country worked for them as an informant, meaning that virtually everybody in the country was under suspicion by the state. Nearly every East German citizen had a file on them that was compiled by the Stasi. The organization amassed more than 1 billion pages of files on East Germany's citizens by the late 1980s, many of which contained personal details about the private lives of East German citizens, tracking people's relationships, hobbies, and personal conversations. Nearly every aspect of citizens' lives was documented and monitored by the Stasi, aided by their secretive planning of surveillance recording bugs into people's private homes, offices, cars, and even public spaces. Due to these factors, migration to the West was a constant problem for East Germany to try and deal with. The land border between the East and the West itself was almost immediately sealed by the time of Germany's formal division in 1949. For decades until 1990, the border here across Germany between East and West was among the most heavily militarized and fortified frontiers anywhere in the world, on a comparable scale to the DMZ that still divides the Korean peninsula between North and South. The German frontier was defined by a continuous line of high metal fences and walls, barbed wire guard towers, anti-vehicle ditches, alarms, and minefields and booby traps that was constantly patrolled by around 50,000 East German border guards with active shoot-to-kill orders in place for anyone attempting to cross it. Nonetheless, following 1949, hundreds of thousands of people continued fleeing or migrating to the West every single year anyway, primarily by taking advantage of the political loophole in Berlin. If an East German visited the western political enclave of West Berlin that was surrounded deep inside of East Germany, they could secure their free travel to West Germany and avoid trying to escape over the fortified frontier. This early migration out of East Germany to the West included a serious brain drain of highly skilled and trained professionals as well, and the problem got so severe for the East and its economy that by 1961, they decided to do something extremely drastic to stop it. Already by that point, more than 2.7 million East Germans had successfully escaped to the West since 1949, and as a consequence, East Germany's population had rapidly declined by about 1/6 in only 12 short years, further hammering East Germany's struggling economy and further boosting the West with millions of additional workers and taxpayers. So in order to stop this bleeding out, the communist East German authorities decided in 1961 to build another wall around the entire perimeter of West Berlin too. This, of course, became the infamous Berlin Wall, a complex series of very visible fortifications, guard towers, and death strips constantly patrolled by East German soldiers, who, like the soldiers guarding the frontier with the West hundreds of miles away, maintained strict shoot-to-kill orders on anyone attempting to cross it. The wall would very publicly divide the city of Berlin for a total of 28 painful years, firmly separating families and friends on either side of it for decades. But despite all of the international outrage, the Berlin Wall's intended purpose, slamming shut the Berlin loophole and the constant stream of Eastern migration to the West, worked tremendously well. Immediately after the wall's construction, migration from the east to the west plummeted to almost nothing, and it will remain at these low levels throughout the rest of the Cold War into the late 1980s. Despite this, escape attempts over the wall into West Berlin by brave Easterners continued. Throughout the wall's 28 years of existence, more than 100,000 people attempted to escape over it, and only a little more than 5,000 of those people were successful in doing so, while at least 136 other people attempting to cross it were killed by East German border guards. But despite the East's extreme levels of repression and authoritarianism, the East also dramatically led the West on numerous social issues. Women in the East, for example, were heavily encouraged to enter into the workforce, and so East Germany was able to go on and achieve the highest rate of female employment ever seen in world history, at an astonishing 91%, leagues higher than even unified Germany's nationwide rate today at only about 56%. East German women were allowed to serve in combat roles in the East military, while they were banned from doing so in the West. The East guaranteed a system of affordable childcare for every mother in the country, enabling mothers to drop off their children at state-run childcare facilities anytime between 5 a.m. on Monday and 6 p.m. on Friday, enabling them to be both mothers and fully committed employees at the same time. In some of East Germany's cities, the rate of young children taking part in these state-run childcare services were as high as 99%. And they were often placed within walking distance of residential flats or factories and collective farms to allow children to be easily dropped off and picked up again. In stark contrast to the West, abortion was also legal and easily accessible, while it was always illegal in the West. Paid vacation became a guaranteed constitutional right in the East, and because of all of these policies that greatly benefited women and mothers, the fertility rate in East Germany actually grew to be much higher than it was in the West by the 1970s, and then remained higher than in the West throughout the rest of the Cold War. So while the political repression and economic opportunities were all worse in the East, it wasn't all universally a worse experience, and in many other ways, life in the East was actually superior, and many of the people who lived there lived full and fulfilling lives that they were truly proud of. For 41 long years, nearly 3.5 times as long as the Third Reich lasted for, and long enough to last through nearly 2 generations of people, these were all the ways that Germany was divided between East and West. And then, all of a sudden near the end of 1989, everything began rapidly changing. In November of that year, a miscommunication by the East German government quickly led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the start of negotiations on full-on German reunification. And within only 11 months from then, by October of 1990, Germany formally reunified and the East German government ceased to exist. In many people's idea of this event today, it's of a new Germany emerging out of the decades of divisions of the Cold War. But what actually happened was that the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany's government, simply expanded to cover the former area of East Germany. The German Democratic Republic died, its citizens voted to become citizens of the Federal Republic of Germany, and so West Germany's government effectively annexed the entire East, which is why modern Germany's official name is still the Federal Republic of Germany, the same government that controlled West Germany throughout the Cold War that was established in 1949. And immediately upon Germany's reunification in 1990, the lasting legacy of the past 41 years of Germany's division between a capitalist and a communist system left behind a daunting gap for the country to bridge. In 1989, the year immediately before reunification and the final year of the East German government's existence, the GDP per capita was more than twice as high in the West as it was in the East. For decades after its founding until the 1970s, East Germany also never made any large-scale investments into their transportation infrastructure. Most of the roads in the rural countryside of East Germany still remained unpaved by the time of reunification in 1990. With only a handful of exceptions, most of the paved motorways in East Germany remained almost unchanged in 1990 from what they were like immediately before the Second World War. And the lack of investment into maintaining them over decades also meant that they had deteriorated significantly. Most of them didn't have shoulder lanes, and there were no protective guardrails over very long distances. In 1989, there were only 4 million cars present in the whole of East Germany for a population of 16.4 million people, meaning that there was only about 1 car present in the East for every 4 people. That meant that with so few people owning cars in the East, the lack of road infrastructure there was never really a very serious problem until all of a sudden it was after reunification in 1990, and the opening up of its unprepared road system to the West. In just the 2 years between 1989 and 1991, the number of vehicles on the roads in East Germany increased by an astonishing 41% due to the opening up of the East to the much larger pool of vehicles in the West. And this unprecedented surge of vehicles into the East's unprepared and outdated road infrastructure initially led to the rate of vehicle fatalities in Germany skyrocketing. Throughout the 1990s, as a result, vehicle fatalities in Germany remained higher than they were previously in the 1980s, before the Eastern road networks were able to be modernized and fixed. But it wasn't just the East's roads that needed to be updated either. Many of East Germany's railways had been deliberately dismantled and hauled away to the Soviet Union after the war as a form of their reparations, and they were only subsequently rebuilt slowly on just a few of the primary lines. All of the East rail electrification was removed by the Soviets after the war, and only began being slowly replaced decades later in the 1970s. Even by the late 1980s, steam-powered railways were still a common practice in the East, while they'd been largely phased out in the West a decade previously by the 1970s. Before reunification, trains in the East were notoriously slow-moving due to this lack of investment in technology. One of the most infamous examples was the express train on the Berlin to Hamburg Railway, which in 1933, right before the Nazi era, typically took 138 minutes to travel, but which as late as 1989, more than half a century later, typically took 243 minutes to travel instead. Nearly twice as long. East Germany's long neglected and underinvested infrastructure had to basically be completely rebuilt by the West after reunification as a result. Of course, for decades leading up to the reunification, West and East Germany had also utilized different currencies as well, the West German Deutsche Mark and the East German Ostmark. Immediately upon their reunification in 1990, West Germany's government decided that their currency, the Deutsche Mark, would become the sole remaining currency of all of Germany going forward, and that the exchange rate between the Deutsche Mark and the Ostmark would be set at 1-to-1. This was probably the only reasonable political decision that could have been taken at the time. If the exchange rate had not been set at a 1-to-1 ratio, it would have sent inflation skyrocketing and probably would have resulted in a mass exodus of Easterners to the West. However, setting the exchange rate at 1-to-1 didn't come without any of its own consequences either. It effectively resulted in a 400% positive revaluation of East Germany's currency, which instantly eliminated the price competitiveness of tons of East German products and services, while East German households and businesses also effectively experienced a 4-fold increase in the burden of their debts. The continued profitability of businesses in East Germany would have only been maintained if their costs were reduced accordingly. But that was impossible because every other input price and overhead cost were also subjected to the exact same revaluation. As a result, there wasn't really a single business in the East that could have effectively withstood this kind of a shock without being supported. On top of this, there was also the business of transitioning decades of East Germany's command-style economy and state-owned enterprises to the West's capitalist market economy, which was accomplished through mass and instant privatization. At the time of reunification, there were more than 8,500 state-owned industrial enterprises in the East with more than 4 million employees. And so, in order to find new private owners for all of them, the government, dominated by the West, set up an organization called the Treuhandanstalt to deal with it. Privatization was immediately extended to the East with no transition period, meaning that inefficient firms in the East, which were most of them, were either shut down en masse or sold off to largely Western investors and businesses at fire sale prices. By 1995, when it was dissolved, the Treuhandanstalt had shut down more than 3,700 industrial plants in the East that it couldn't find a buyer for. And out of the plants and firms that it did manage to sell, only 5% of them were actually sold to fellow Easterners, while the overwhelming 85% of them were sold at usually bargain bin prices to Westerners, reinforcing the deeply implanted economic divide between the East and the West even further, and also leading to mass unemployment and social dislocation in the East. A sociologist named Paul Windolf has estimated that in just the 5 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, up to 80% of workers in East Germany lost their jobs either temporarily or permanently, leaving behind a lasting legacy of resentment and a distrust of sudden change. For years after reunification, the unemployment rate in East Germany was most often higher than 15% of the labor force, and it consistently remained twice as high as the German national average all the way until the 2010s. For many East Germans, the sudden shock of transitioning to the privatized market economy was a sink-or-swim scenario that they struggled to quickly adapt to. Around 2,000 women who served in East Germany's military were suddenly fired and were left without any ability to continue their profession. Across all of the East German states between 1989 and 2007, the government slashed 60% of the previously almost universal public daycare spots for young children under the age of 3, dramatically reducing Eastern women's participation in the country's labor force and hampering their social mobility. At the time of reunification, West Germany's open market economy had been further bolstered by decades of the government's welcoming migration policies. In the 1980s, there were as many as 4.5 million foreigners who were present in West Germany, who had largely come to the country in search of work and who made up about 7% of the West's total population. While in comparison, there were only a paltry 192,000 foreigners who were present in East Germany by 1989, representing only about 1% of the East's total population. The East was substantially more ethnically homogeneous at the time of unification than the West was. And to make matters still worse for the East, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain quickly prompted millions of East Germans themselves to migrate to the more prosperous West. Well-educated and highly skilled workers in the East knew that they could earn multiple times their salaries in the East if they just relocated to the West, while younger East Germans also knew that their economic opportunities would be superior in the West as well. Immediately during and after reunification, this led to a skyrocketing rate of migration of East Germans to the West again, after the previous 28 years of being bottled up and contained by the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. Net migration within Germany saw more Easterners moving west than Westerners moving east for years until 2017. All in all, between these years, more than 3,681,000 East Germans packed up and moved to the West, while only a little more than 1.6 million Westerners moved east, representing a net loss of roughly 2 million people from the East to the West over the years that have followed the reunification. And those losses of Easterners to the West were most often more economically valuable demographics, like young people and skilled and educated workers. It's been estimated that more than a quarter of the young East German population between the ages of 18 and 30 migrated to the West following reunification, leaving a larger proportion of older and less educated people in the East behind. At the same time, the more than 1.6 million Westerners who migrated east after reunification were largely wealthier and moved more towards large East German cities rather than to the countryside. The new Western arrivals were able to take advantage of their higher purchasing power to buy up desirable properties in the major cities of the East, which pushed many native Easterners further out to the city's less expensive fringes, and further left the eastern countryside without any replacement for the Easterners who migrated west. This mass migration from east to west following the reunification only served to further devalue the East's economic potential and productivity, while it also reduced the East's tax income and collapsed the social infrastructure across the rural communities of the East. As fewer young people led to the closures of schools and hospitals and sports facilities, the worse and worse it became. It also served to only further strengthen the West's economy, as it received a net of nearly 2 million East Germans who were mostly young and well-educated that rejuvenated their own working-age demographic, which is a large part of why the proportion of well-educated people in the East is still lower than in the West today, and why the school dropout rate in the East still remains higher than the national average. The shock and uncertainty in the East following the reunification also led to a complete collapse in the East's fertility rate, as uncertainties over employment and the collapse of the state-run childcare services led to many people deciding to push back or give up on having children altogether. Between 1990 and 1994, the birth rate in East Germany, which had been higher than in the West for decades, collapsed by more than half to become dramatically lower than in the West. And then they remained lower in the East for a decade and a half until the mid-2000s. The combination of this crash in the birth rate in the East throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, and the simultaneous exodus of the East's young people moving to the West, is what has contributed to East Germany's significantly older age and demographics today, which is even more acutely felt in the East German countryside, where it's often difficult to find people younger than the age of 50 today. Over time, the enormous differences between the East and the West were steadily patched up and bridged, as the West invested massive sums of money into the East. West Germany would ultimately pour around 2 trillion euros worth of investment into the East following the reunification, funds that went towards rebuilding and modernizing the East's neglected infrastructure, helping to transition the East's economy away from an industrial one towards a services-based one, and social benefits that tried their best to aid the transition from communism towards capitalism. The East's competitiveness steadily improved over time due to these investments, and within a decade after the collapse of the wall, the GDP per capita in the East had skyrocketed from only about a third of the level seen in the West to nearly 2/3 of it, while the unemployment rate in the East declined from more than 15% throughout the 1990s and early 2000s to only around 6% today. Nonetheless, the scars left behind from Germany's past of division continue to remain atop of the country today. GDP per capita in the East is still only about 80% of what it is in the West today. East Germans, on average, still work longer hours than their counterparts in the West do, and are still paid less money due to their lower productivity. East Germans are still way underrepresented in the country's most elite professions. Less than 5% of Germany's federal judges and top 100 largest company CEOs today are Easterners. And there are no Easterners currently who are generals in the German army. A study from as recently as 2023 by researchers from the universities of Leipzig and Jena found that fewer than 1 in 8 leaders across Germany's businesses, politics, public administration, and art and culture had actually been born in the East. Even though the West poured massive amounts of money into helping develop the East after reunification, the nature of how it was actually handled and carried out, with the massive immediate privatizations and the fire sale of Eastern businesses to the West, was more like giving someone fish after seizing their fishing rod. Since most of the East's industries and businesses were sold off to wealthy Western interests following the reunification, a large part of Germany's subsequent transfer of wealth from the West to the East essentially went from Western taxpayers to the East and then bounced right back to their new Western owners through rents and profits. Through this lens, the wealth transfer in Germany from West to East following reunification was more like a transfer from Western workers to wealthy Western capital owners, and it was only just recycled through the infrastructure and welfare programs that were undertaken in the East. As a result of all of this, many people in Eastern Germany feel like they were annexed and pillaged by a West that had evolved for decades without them, rather than being included and incorporated as equals like they thought they would be during the jubilations of 1989. As a result of this legacy, there is a significant degree of resentment and mistrust towards further change and towards the West that is still felt in the East today. This attitude in the East has also extended into a pronounced reluctance to take on risks. Perhaps understandably, millions of East Germans who experienced the sudden and unexpected shock of their entire society and all of its values collapsing virtually overnight and forcing them to start all over again from scratch, tended to act more cautiously and avoided risk-taking in the future. Attitudes that were then passed down to their children who were born after the wall fell. Easterners had none of the generational advantages that the Westerners had either, who had a 41-year head start over them on accumulating capital and assets through decades of a prosperous and growing economy over many generations that were passed down from one to the next, enabling more Westerners to feel secure enough to take on risks and to pursue innovation. Perhaps leading to why entrepreneurship is still so much less common in the East than it is in the West today. Faced with the overall experience of reunification, which on the one hand opened up significantly more political freedoms to the East, but which on the other also brought enormous insecurities and economic disruption, there is a substantial feeling among Easterners today that since they already fundamentally changed their lives once following 1989, and were not well rewarded for doing it, they shouldn't have to be asked to change their society once again, such as their increasing migration and diversity that they rightly or wrongly fear could upend all of their hard-won gains since the calamity of the 1990s. This, along with Easterners' suspicion of the mainstream West German parties like the CDU and the SPD that led the reunification process, have created the perfect storm of conditions for non-traditional far-right parties like the AfD, along with far-left parties that are also opposed to further migration like the BSW, to thrive in the East today. The fear among a lot of Easterners today that needs to be understood by the West and by people beyond is that they feel like their gains that they've painfully achieved since the 1990s, like their homes, their cars, and their secure jobs, are now being threatened once again by policies being dictated upon them by an out-of-touch West, this time through large-scale migration. Parties like the AfD and the BSW have been tremendously successful at capitalizing on East Germany's deep-seated resentment toward the West, their historical affinity towards Russia, and their fears of further change represented through migration. Because of that, these more radical far-right and far-left parties are likely to continue remaining dominant in the East's political arena for a long while to come, as the divisions between East and West Germany continue to linger behind in just about every data map of Germany you see today. And that will be very difficult for Germany today to overcome in the short term. Over the past month, as Germany hosted their federal election that revealed how divided between East and West the country still remains today, it felt like a normal year's worth of worldwide events were all condensed into just a matter of weeks. Besides for Germany's election and the record-setting performance of the AfD party, US President Donald Trump called for the United States to take control over the Gaza Strip. Israeli forces largely withdrew from most of their occupied areas within the Gaza Strip, while they also refused to withdraw from southern Lebanon after their previously agreed-upon deadline to do so. And they also demanded the complete demilitarization of southern Syria and began expanding their airstrikes there against the new Syrian government. Rwandan-backed M23 rebels marched into the city center of Bukavu, the second largest city in the eastern DRC and the capital of the country's South Kivu province, while the ongoing war in Ukraine grimly entered into its fourth year of operations, in tandem with massive shifts in US foreign policy related to the war, including the US voting against a measure at the United Nations condemning Russia for the invasion, and a now infamous explosion between Presidents Trump and Zelensky in the White House. Every month, so many important things are currently happening from developing conflicts around the world that it's almost impossible to actually keep up with it all, no matter how well informed you want to be. I wanted to start creating one new video a month that covers all of these increasingly major developments from conflicts taking place around the world to help you stay as up to date as possible on what's taking place in our world and why during this time of increasing global conflict. And that's why I created my new War Room series, a monthly video briefing series that covers all of the most significant geopolitical updates from conflicts taking place around the world that you need to be the most well-informed about. The latest episode in this series covers all of the most important conflict developments that took place last month throughout February that you might have missed in all the noise. You can go and watch the February episode of War Room right now. I'm also releasing new episodes in War Room over there covering major global conflict updates every single month. while I also have dozens of exclusive full-length real-life lore documentaries on Nebula as well in my separate Modern Conflict series, giving you deep dives into major recent conflicts that would otherwise also be demonetized and age-restricted if they were on YouTube. With current documentaries you can choose from ranging from the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, to Israel's wars with Hamas, to the Myanmar, Sudan, Yemen, and Syria civil wars, and tons of others, with new episodes getting released every single month as well. And what's even more, you also get access to all of the other amazing exclusive content that's available on Nebula, because the best part about this site is that it's jointly co-owned by all of its creators, built by myself and hundreds of other YouTubers and podcasters. And because it's a subscription-based service, we all get to work on way bigger and higher budget productions over there than we could ever afford to do on YouTube. That's why there's tons of other exclusive content that you'll find equally fascinating from all of these other creators over there you probably also already know as well. And best of all, if you sign up by clicking the button that's here on your screen right now, or by following the link that's down below in the description, you'll receive an insane 40% discount off of an annual subscription, which means that it'll only cost you $3 a month or $36 a year for all of this awesome exclusive content from myself and hundreds of other independent creators, with even more stuff getting added every single month. And if you already have a Nebula subscription and you want to give one to a friend or a loved one, you can now do that as well with a gifted subscription with the exact same discount by following the link that's down in the description too. I don't run a Patreon, so this is the absolute best way to help support what I'm doing here on Real Life Lore. And as always, thank you so much for watching.